This is the Entrepreneur on Campus podcast. Let's go. On each episode, we talk about a new industry or market, including the entrepreneurial opportunities, the pains, and the surprises of that industry. Listen, the business world is so broad, and we are here to dissect all of the different ways that entrepreneurs make money.
Software, you make it one time and sell it 1,000 times.
E-com spaces, man, those things sell for like an 8x multiple. It's ridiculous.
Three main ways that we make money, and the primary one is actually ad sales.
The goal is usually to exit within 3 to 7 years.
I'm your host, Matthew Brown, and I've created this podcast to help you discover hidden opportunities. Thank you for tuning in, and here is today's episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Entrepreneur on Campus podcast. I'm super excited to have Jeb Hurley with me today. Jeb, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
So I met Jeb recently at a Rev Road meetup, and I was able to chat with him a little bit and was really inspired by how excited you were and passionate about life and the things that you've done. And it seems like you've had such an amazing and diverse career. And I want to illustrate that just by starting off with your bio. So Dr. Jeb Hurley is the co-founder and CEO of Xmetrics and the author of Team Relationships Management, The Art of Crafting Extraordinary Teams. His passion is inspiring more conscious leadership, helping leaders to place as much emphasis on forging strong, trusting relationships and well-being as they do bottom-line results. His expertise is applying behavioral science to team leadership practices. Dr. Hurley's career journey began on new product innovation teams in Europe and Asia, leading to GM, VP, and CEO roles at companies ranging from Fortune 500 to VC-backed startups, as well as co-founding 3 software companies. He regularly speaks and writes about team leadership and is also the author of The One Habit, the ultimate guide to increasing engagement and building highly effective teams, and has published over 60 articles on team leadership. Jeb, obviously you've done a lot of amazing things in your life. I also saw on your LinkedIn profile that you've had quite a bit of schooling. Can you tell me what your schooling career has looked like? What schools have you assisted or attended?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to kind of have an interesting mix of both, life experiences, career experiences, educational experiences. An undergraduate actually degrees in history and economics from a small school up in northwestern Pennsylvania, a small Jesuit school called Gannon. I did my master's, my MBA at University of Pittsburgh, and then earned much more recently. It was one of those bucket list things that I was. They attempted to recruit me into the PhD program back when I was finishing my master's, and there was no way. I was done with school. I wanted to go work. I wanted to go do things. And so I put that off. But 5-6 years ago, began doing a doctorate in leadership and specifically focused on at the intersection of human motivation, team effectiveness, and employee engagement. So I completed my doctorate in 2017.
Yeah. Okay. So fairly recently.
Yeah. And then I've also had the good fortune of, sort of terms of formal education around leadership. I went to very early on, I participated in the Center for Creative Leadership's Leadership Development Program, which is a intensive tear you down, build you up. And then at Harvard, their program, and then something called the Aspen Institute, which is this kind of amazing sort of think tank at their leadership at the peak, which was an opportunity to sort of look at leadership from a global perspective. So I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to do those.
Yeah, and I'm curious to ask you, because you've had all this formal education, you've also been a founder of, like you said, 3 software companies. You participated with large companies as well. How has formal education benefited you specifically? Because my audience is targeting aspiring entrepreneurs. So how has that helped you with your startups?
Matthew, that's a good question because, I think that, I'm a huge, obviously a huge believer in education, but also in entrepreneurship. And they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, setting the stories of students quitting Harvard and going off and starting, multi-mega billion-dollar companies, okay, that's like two, right? But that's not, I think that's not the story or the kind of the life experience for the vast majority of people. And, I actually believe that, education benefits us in so many ways, whether it's critical thinking skills or just a richer life. Entrepreneurship, is it's freedom. It's the ability to pursue a purpose, and if you're cut out for that, I found the two to be incredibly complementary, not mutually exclusive, and neither are they. They both serve the same ends in the sense of creating options for people, an opportunity to pursue one's passions and find purpose in what we do. And how far we pursue either one of them, I think, is much more a function of who we are as an individual and where we find purpose, as opposed to do I do one? Do I do the other? It just hasn't been my experience.
That is great insight. What would you advise college students who are interested in starting a business during college, and they have kind of the opportunity of dropping out? You say try to finish and get somewhat of a formal degree, and then focus on your business, or what is your opinion on that?
Yeah. So, again, it's hard to, and I don't want to be parental, in sort of advice, but, my own experience has been there isn't any reason why you can't do both. I mean, I grew up in a family business. And I went to school and I worked in helping with a startup. And when we created XMet, and then fast forward several decades in creating Xmetrics, I was running I was a general manager at HP in Asia. I was starting a new company, and I was doing my doctorate. So it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. And I don't. By the way, I don't recommend that for everybody, because that was actually insane.
Yeah.
I don't recommend giving up your weekends for 3 or 4 years. But the point really is that there's no formula. There's no prescription for it. I think everyone has to look into sort of who they are and where you want to be, and recognize that they aren't binaries. You've got lots of options as you look to create something, as well as and if you find purpose in both, do both.
Yeah. Okay. And as far as going into your career a little bit, did you start with the startups then, or did you start with some traditional jobs? What was kind of your journey?
Yeah, it's my journey was and interesting. It's more like sailing than powerboating. But I did start in startups, but that was because I was born into it. So when I was a teenager in middle school, my dad actually left. He had grown up in a family business, became a teacher actually, but kind of went back to his entrepreneurial roots when I was in middle school. And that sort of threw myself and then ultimately my younger brothers back into a startup environment. And this was in specialty retail, wasn't high tech or anything. But so I grew up sort of with the notion of, you work to build something. It paid for my college education. So very much in that. And that led me. But interestingly, I also had a desire and an ambition to see what I could do in the corporate world. So I sort of interspersed my first role out of the MBA, when I really sort of stepped away from the family business, was at a fast-growing tech startup. So I did that for a few years, but then moved to a large 150-year-old Japanese company, because I wanted international experience. Lived and worked in Japan, and then it began a 10-year period of rapidly moving up in terms of responsibilities. First at Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, and then at Kodak. This was through the late 90s. Ultimately in a corporate vice president and general manager role, running a big division, about a $1 billion division of Kodak. So And then the golden rings were bright and shiny in 2000. And I also lost, there was a CEO, and I was a level below that, but there was the ascension of a new CEO. I was actually in a camp of a different co-COO. So that'll get you fired fairly fast, and it did, which was just fine. And that's when I moved into really back to my sort of entrepreneurial roots. I was recruited by some VCs to become CEO of what was the first immersive imaging company, which became a demonstration in the bleeding edge of technology, where we had a great idea that was about a decade, maybe 15 years too early. Mm-hmm. The sensor technology and the internet just wasn't there yet. But that began the path to, that really has kept me, through the 2010 or so, I guess. I spent a 10-year period doing startups and software companies.
Very cool. Can you tell me a little bit about those software companies?
Yeah, well, as I said, the first one was in immersive imaging, and that was really it was a combination of what's called computational camera systems and software that we started out doing 360-degree immersive experiences for Disney and travel and all of that. But it turned out, you actually needed, megapixel sensors and, back then the equivalent of dedicated fiber optic, which today we take for granted, 4G and what we carry around in our pocket is more powerful than, what was literally a $50,000 sensor back in 2000, 2001. But we had the good fortune of support from the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And after 9/11, and the collapse of the dot-coms, and you really couldn't raise any funding in the venture markets, and we were still very early stage. But we ended up building, it was kind of cool. We pivoted to a defense company, and we ended up building situational awareness capabilities first for the Los Angeles class submarines, gave them 360-degree infrared capability, and then other situational awareness situations or capabilities for various branches of the armed services. So it felt pretty good because I felt like we were doing something to help save lives and create better, sort of awareness for, people who are in service to the country.
Right. So is this a software system that helps all of these clients of yours train and learn how to be better soldiers, or what is it that it helps?
No, it's actually, so situational awareness was actually, think of it. So we had applications. So against on the submarine, when a periscope comes up, it has a very, very powerful, but very narrow range of vision.
Yeah.
Whereas with 360-degree capability, it enabled it to sense, anything in the surrounding area, to identify that there was something out there, particularly in the dark, that it could then train its other sensors on.
Wow.
We also built 360 cameras for little robots used in urban, in urban situations where they would send the robots in to not put soldiers in harm's way. Again, providing a 360-degree awareness view.
Wow, very cool. And so this company, I imagine you sold it to not a ton of clients, but for higher prices, right? Because
yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly right. It turned out only the Defense Department was the only one that had the money and the willingness to put these very expensive sensors and fiber optic cables and all of that together to be able to use it.
Yeah. Okay. And so did you leave that company at a certain point and then go start another one when you had an idea?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I had what I guess you'd call a soft exit in that I wasn't a military guy. The venture capital, the VCs wanted someone with military experience, brought in a retired admiral as CEO, which was fine by me because again, it was fun, but not my thing.
Yeah.
And that gave me the freedom to go off and actually jump into my next startup. Company called Resonance Technologies, where in kind of also pursuing my interest in neuropsychology and kind of human behavior. This is sort of the beginnings of it. And we built software for, it was called Extreme Insights. It was software that measured people's emotional or affective responses to messagings, advertising, new products. So we began helping out consumer goods companies and like Mattel or companies like Coca-Cola in evaluating new product ideas for how people felt about their experience, which is kind of cool.
So it's kind of a physical way to map out. So you showed me an example of your most recent software startup, Xmetrics.
Right.
And it's something that is typically, so you showed me how it's used, and basically shows you on a scale and a graph of where you are at with the relationships with the people on your team. And
exactly.
It's something that's intangible that you've made tangible. Is this other startup that you're talking to me about? Is that kind of similar? Just you have.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that was kind of the beginning. And also, it's, you had asked about career journey, and it's very much, things build on themselves over time. And you find, sort of where you find meaning and purpose, what you do, it emerges. It's like a primordial soup that emerges. It's not something that, you just suddenly wake up some morning and say, this is what I'm going to do. So these interests that I could trace them probably all the way back to, childhood and then my early university experiences and that. But, I was just fascinated by why did people do what they did? And happened to connect with some brilliant people that I was fortunate to be able to partner with in building out this Resonance Technologies Extreme Insight software. And yes, it was all about how to use new technology to get at something that's been around since humans, which is our emotional responses, our affective responses to a stimulus. But do it in a unique, innovative way, and then we build a software interface that was truly revolutionary at the time, because no one was really looking at how it is people responded to stimulus like that, but being able to then turn it into visual maps and guidance for brands.
I'm curious what kind of input that your software took in order to display what customers are thinking and feeling.
Well, at that time, so this now goes back to like 2005, 2006 or so. It was by comparison to what we've done at Xmetrics, it was a fairly complex. People they would get in a stimulus, looking at a new idea, a new, messaging or advertising slogan, and then go through a series of responses to that, questions. And then we use the insights from those questions to go through a little bit of what's called a coding process. We kind of teased out the themes and then use those to present back to, via software and a dashboard, how people were reacting. But it was a fairly complex and labor intensive. We took the labor and put it into the software, but it had a complexity to it that made it, you couldn't just put it out there and it didn't have a high ease of use. You just couldn't put it out there and just let anybody use it.
Yeah. Okay. So did you join this from the very beginning, or did you join it after it had already been going for a little while?
So it was actually, there was an existing company that that funded it, and I was one of the co-founders of a new entity called Resonance Technologies Inc. And ultimately the company that funded it, and it was for them because they were a very high end consulting firm, doing $100,000 to $1 million project types of things. So we became kind of a wholly owned software company, but independent. We were a independent stock corporation that ultimately the company that funded us acquired us. Which was very cool for them. So we built the capability, demonstrated it, and they said, okay, this is good enough that we want to buy it. So that was cool.
So did it take a long time to develop the software? And then at what point could you start selling it and start seeing a return on the investment?
Yeah, so it took about a year to do that. And then by year 3, it was up, running, generating good revenues to the point where the original company said, we want this part of our ongoing business, which was fantastic. So that one was about a 3-year project.
Cool. And it was a traditional kind of SaaS price modeling where there's a monthly subscription payment?
No, in this case, it was not, because again, the complexity of the software and the nature of who we were dealing with, it was more project based, because our target was it was big brand. It was enterprise. Think of it more as an enterprise big brand model. So people were coming in buying, in $10,000 chunks. So it was very much an enterprise model.
Okay. So right now you're working with Xmetrics, and Xmetrics focuses as much on small business as on large business, right?
It does.
So what are some key points of selling to these big enterprise businesses like you did in your previous business?
Yeah, well, I guess it, maybe start with sort of Xmetrics itself is, it's team relationship management tools for team leaders. And that's important because, if you're looking at startups or necessarily smaller or mid-sized businesses versus enterprises, the product itself has to be distinguished, because if you're building enterprise software, you're not selling it to startups, right? That's why Salesforce has one product for early stage companies and another one for enterprises. In the case of Xmetrics, we're focused on teams. So a team of 7 people at a startup and a team of 7 people, at HP, have a lot more in common than they have differences. Right. So that's where Xmetrics as a software as a service platform, and using a more traditional SaaS model, we're able to and it is somewhat unique that we can tap into a customer set, in a scaling startup and reduce their risk, or in a global virtual team at HP, who happens to be one of our customers, that are using it and the dynamic is the same. So we don't have to go in at a mega company like HP. We're not selling into the IT department and having to roll out a platform there. Literally, departments or even just individual teams are able to take advantage of the tools, which is kind of unique in the SaaS world.
That is very unique. And does that make the sales cycle a lot quicker?
It does. And that was part of the intent, having having the good fortune of being both sides, right? So I was, a executive in very large companies and then doing the startups. So, I know the barriers to getting inside these big companies. And, and often they're in the software world, they sit in 2 places, IT and HR. Unless if you're Salesforce, the sales department. So, if you can avoid the big barriers of having to, the long sales cycles involved, you can get your product into an organization and being piloted much more quickly.
If there's somebody listening to this podcast that has some kind of tech startup and they have the goal of selling to these large companies, do you have any recommendations on how to overcome the barriers?
Well, I don't know if it's so much overcoming as in you just have to have the capital and the patience. You just have to know that, the reality of this, even if you have something very valuable, and many companies do, these are just long sales cycles. Yeah. And your customer acquisition cost, your CAC, is going to be higher. Because, you've got to put the face time in, you have to think in terms of, from the customer's perspective, who's making the decisions and where do those decision makers sit in terms of level in the organization. And remember that, their days, everybody's days feel like they're changing tires on moving cars. So, you're going to get a little tiny slice of their time at first. And again, persistence, patience, and continuing to look at it from, the problem you're solving for them and why it matters, as opposed to the fact that you want to sell to company X or Y. I mean, you and everybody else. I mean, that's the reality.
It's got to be an amazing day, though, when the sales cycle finally finishes.
Yeah, of course it is. Although, the other word of caution is that, these large companies, they play hardball. I mean, it's, I have one of my brothers. He's in the material science world and builds a lot of product, and their customers are the Costco's, the Walmarts, the Sam's Club. these guys are, they are tough to deal with. It's not just on the sales cycle, it's on the customer success side as well. If you haven't developed that capability in your organization, it'll kill you.
Okay. And transitioning a little bit, talking more about Xmetrics, can you tell me what industry Xmetrics is in? And you kind of mentioned who your market is, that you can target a lot of different people. But yeah, what's your industry and market generally?
So, yeah, sure. So industry is, of course, software, and more specifically SaaS, or software as a service. In terms of being more specific though about the market, we have both the blessing and the curse of creating a category. Team relationship management, you can kind of think CRM or customer relationship management, but we're doing it for teams. Actually didn't exist. If you go into Google and put team relationship management in quotes, you will get us. And again, on one hand, that's exciting. It's really cool. And, but it's a nightmare because, you're literally creating a category. And so, that's why I've written a couple of books and published a lot of articles. You have to build an ecosystem that helps define the category as people begin to use it. And then, the software itself, the tools, while in theory, they could be used by any team to help build the trusting relationships that leads to better performance and well-being. The reality is different, right? You've got to find that product market message fit, and it's hypothesis in the beginning. I mean, and my hypotheses are formed by a lot of years of experience in a number of different environments. But it's interesting today. If we look at our early kind of pilots and customers, they range from mega company like HP to, maybe a dozen startups who are looking to reduce their scaling risk. We also have some mid-sized companies who are, who solve problems with their high-value knowledge workers in areas like R&D and design. So we're still very much, we soft launched in May, so we're a baby.
Yeah.
And so we're really, interestingly, I had just reached out back to the CAT school at the University of Pittsburgh. And so some of the MBA teams there are going to try the software as well, because I've had a couple of people say, wow, this would be great for, identifying and reducing dysfunction on MBA teams, but also as a leader training and development tool to help to help leaders in business school get a real sense of what you need to do to develop this trust and relationships on teams. So I said, sure, we'll pilot it.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand everything that you were saying when you were telling it to me, but then you showed it to me and it became so apparent, like how valuable it would be. I'm curious if you have some place online where people could just go look and see like what it is, what it looks like.
Well, hopefully and we continuously are refining the website, xmetrics.com. It now, I think, tells a pretty good story in terms of the kind of, what we're trying to do and our mission in terms of, people's well-being at work and team performance. There's lots of little videos in there now. It's definitely not where we want it to be, as an end state, but the feedback has been pretty good that, people kind of get that, particularly using a metaphor like radar for a team, that, it identifies issues early. It presents them in a way that enables teams and team leaders to deal with it. And the benefit of that is huge, just like it is in our personal lives. If you close gaps between what people expect of you and what they experience, you build trust. And if you don't, it tends to deteriorate. And ultimately, it's what causes people to disengage from relationships.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And I think it's really cool how you've been able to tie what you've studied formally and what you're interested in into a startup, and how that's what you're focusing on now. Really cool.
Yeah, thanks. That's kind of the ultimate in finding, you hear, the Simon Sinek Find Your Why, which I think is actually, that's a very cool book because it focuses on how you do it, not just you should, everyone can say, it's like saying to somebody, well, find passion. And they look at you like, okay, thanks. But sure, how do you do that? But, that process of finding what you're, where you find meaning and purpose in what you do, does have a little bit, has at least a rhythm to it. And, it's like storytelling and building narratives and themes. And as you do that in your career, bringing them together is kind of cool, as you said.
Yeah, that's awesome. Last couple of questions I have for you. So one is, I have a couple of friends that are in some SaaS startups, and I've been curious about their pricing, and one of my friends has said that the pricing, like they don't know where the market has their, like what they value their product at. And so they're just throwing out numbers and seeing how people react, and then kind of over time, just finding the right price. Do you feel like you've done the same thing, or has it been something that you kind of knew how you were going to price from the beginning?
Yeah, no, I think, pricing is as much art as it is science. But there is a bit of both, and, if you're in once you understand where you fall in the SaaS kind of world, and there's kind of really two spaces. One is enterprise, and that has a cluster of, it's not like you're the first person doing SaaS enterprise, and it will have a cluster of companies in it that have priced already. So that at least gives you indicative pricing. Same thing in the automated space, where you're looking to, drive kind of where Xmetrics sits, where whether we sell into one or the other isn't the point. It's if your software is designed as automated, there's also a kind of a range of price points there that give you an initial indication. It's where people tend to get in trouble is when they fall in what is really the kill zone. They're not really enterprise, they're not really automated, and that's usually that's often a death zone within SaaS. But after that, I think what your friends are doing is spot on. I mean, you basically then, particularly if you've got something innovative and unique, it's iterative. Yeah. And the cool thing about SaaS is, I mean, we already doubled our price once. Mm-hmm. Based on sort of early on, and then got feedback, how it was solving problems. And everybody's got an opinion. Now, I've sat down with, not because we're raising capital at the moment, but just for feedback with the venture capitalists. And, some will be, wow, this should be so much higher. And others are like, wow, there's millions of people who would benefit from this. And, it's all in your worldview. Do you see this as smaller numbers at a higher price, or, you change the world a bit by, having millions of people on teams using it, in which case, you can have a modest price and still do well. So
right.
That's the art part of it.
All right. And this might be putting you on the spot a little bit. I'm curious if you know any articles or books that you would recommend to have a better contextual understanding of SaaS companies.
Of SaaS. You know what? I don't know if it's so much, because I find, the problem, just like with my own book, you work on it a couple of years, you put it out, it's got, at least I believe in my case, it's got real value for teams. Yeah. But, in fast-moving environments, I much more recommend, if you go online and whether it's pricing, whether it's strategy, whether it's models, there is so much information out there. I mean, Medium as a resource has time, and some really, writers who have a lot of experience in building SaaS companies. And I think the main thing is get as many points of view as possible and then form your own out of that. So I don't think it's a matter of a book, because honestly, I've not really seen, I mean, there are books out there that talk about SaaS, but SaaS software and building software businesses, but really the richness of the amount of information out there. Yeah. And then you also have, resources like Udemy and the other Coursera, Harvard X that also will have courses and, that bring some of the latest. So really, as a founder or co-founder of a SaaS company, your bigger problem is just information overload. There's so much out there. You've got to, but I think making a habit of, and I do this, I regularly look for, articles. I'll use something called Toby, which is a great little Chrome add-on that you're able to just grab it, put it into a folder and come back to it later. But my SaaS folder is huge with lots of articles and references, categorized by things like pricing or strategy or inbound marketing, that kind of thing.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. That was very useful. last question I have related to business.
Sure.
So you've been involved with a lot of tech companies. Do you know like how to code, and whether you do or not, how have you been able to find other developers that are willing to come and help you with your startup?
Yeah, good question. So the very simple answer to the, unless you consider doing basic if-then statements coding, which I don't, and no one else would. No, as I described earlier in my educational background, mine has been, as both from an education and a business standpoint, been much more, I rapidly moved into general management and kind of haven't moved away from that. Mm-hmm. But, I had the good fortune that first role out of B school was in a tech company that was just dominated by lots of PhD engineers and all of that. And the only way I was going to survive was, I realized, not to become an engineer, because they were already 20 years ahead of me, but to understand technology in the context of the customer. And so and this was a telecoms company. And so I learned all of the language, around packet switching and protocol layers and all of that. And then focused my attention on understanding what the customer needed. And that I found, as over time I've built and run, technology companies, I got a very good sense of what is it that produces great products. And that has enabled me to, sort of identify and attract the kind of, including kind of my current CTO co-founder. And she is a phenomenal, unusual in that she does front-end design, full stack development, and has a customer experience background. Wow. And, but that's what I was looking for, because coming at it from the business side, there's lots of people who can write code pretty well, and they're deep into that, and that's important. There are people who understand the customer experience. There's people who can do front end and design type work. I recognize that finding sort of the intersections of those is where real innovation comes from. And so, that's in part because I can spell Python and Ruby on Rails, and that's about as far as I go. But you build strong, trusting relationships with people who do it in their sleep. And that's the key.
Oh, that's great. That's really insightful for me. I'm studying information systems right now at a university, and don't know how much I love diving into actual coding and programming, but kind of like you, I do want to have a really good overview of vocabulary and understanding of technology in general.
Exactly. And that's gold, because you got to be able to speak the language. But once you speak the language, it doesn't mean that you have to be, have a deep understanding as a linguist, or, in the etymology and the development of the language. No, you just have to know enough that if you're going to be in the world of tech, that you're able to put it in context. And then ultimately, again, it's ultimately about relationships, and, being able to build that bond and that trust with a variety of people who have a broad range of skills that you as a leader bring together to accomplish something amazing.
Love it. Last question I'm going to ask you, Jeb, is do you have one life lesson to share with young aspiring entrepreneurs?
You're not the first person to ask that. I think that in my observation, I had the good fortune of bringing on, when I was doing work in Asia for HP, of bringing on a lot of new grads. And I think that my one piece of advice would be that if you're coming into, and of course, this is the tech industry, but it could be finance, it could be any, but know the history of the industry you're coming into. Know where it came from, because, this is advice I had wished I had gotten 20 years ago.
Yep.
That because if you have that sense of where it's come from, how it was built, you have a broader perspective other than just the role you're in and the job you're in and the company you're in, and you see more opportunity. And so, I think history, it's not history for history's sake. It's history for the sake of having a sense of where an industry is and where it's going into the future as you build your career.
Mm.
And, and I'll give you a quick example. You had asked about books earlier. This is one that if you're going into the tech industry, read The Innovators by Walter Isaacson, because it shows you how today's tech giants came about. But it also gives you a sense of, as you look at your career going forward, wow, maybe I had to have, be a little more heads up in seeing where the opportunities are going to emerge. It's kind of the Wayne Gretzky, where the puck's going to be, rather than chasing it, because every day you're just overwhelmed with your current job. So, I think that, I'm always reticent to give kind of advice, but that's one that I found really is, and it makes you a more interesting person.
Yeah.
Because you actually know a little bit about, as opposed to, yeah, sure, I'm a wizard on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. So what?
Right.
You actually know where this stuff came from and why.
Yeah.
And it also, at dinner parties, you're a little more interesting as well.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, on having a broad overview understanding of things versus the narrow perspective. One of my friends just read a book on this it's called Range. I don't know if you've heard of that. But he was telling me about it, and the whole idea is that generalists, people who understand the bigger picture, they actually win, because in the past 15 to 20 years, there's been so much focus on specialization and niching down. But actually having an understanding and perspective of how everything works, that's where, like you said, you can see a lot more opportunities. So totally agree with that.
Exactly. And, even, if you may be a extremely talented, coder but having the context of of what the industry you're doing that in and how it plays out, will give you a broader perspective on if nothing else, the possibilities in your career. And that's pretty powerful.
Awesome. Well, Jeb, thank you so much for coming on today.
Matthew, my pleasure.
I feel super honored, because you've had such a diverse experience, both in your career and with education. And I think you gave some great insight, and I really hope that my audience, the people who are listening to this, will also enjoy it. I'm sure they will.
Well, fantastic. And, anyone that is interested in sort of what I do and what we do, you can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And, and I'm always, and if people have questions, I'm always happy to, give a point of view and an insight, or tell you I don't know. And that's where I find purpose.
Awesome. Jeb Hurley on Instagram. And then your website is xmetrics.com, right?
xmetrics.com. Yeah, actually, Instagram, probably not. On LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Perfect.
LinkedIn. Yeah, I think the companies that we have, Xmetrics is on Instagram. I can only keep up with so many social media outlets. I'm on Facebook. LinkedIn is kind of the main one. And then also drjebhurley.com is kind of my site for books and related material.
Great. Jeb, cool. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Matthew, my pleasure. Have a fantastic day.
You too.
Thank you guys again for listening. I love you. Have a good one.